How much does heat impact your performance? Do you get slower as you get hotter? Is black kit actually worse than white kit? And what things can you do to make yourself faster in hot conditions? There are so many questions on this topic, and they have implications for all of us, whether we're riding in the heat of summer, maybe in an epic event that you've been preparing for, or if you're training and racing indoors. To find out about this, and to get answers to these questions and more, I spoke to Dr. Lee Taylor, a researcher and scientist at Loughborough University. Lee's research focuses on preparing elite athletes, both individuals and teams, for racing in very hot conditions. So he's worked with pro triathletes and pro cycling teams as well. He also looks at the therapeutic potential of different temperature conditions in addition. Hi Lee, thanks for joining us. It's great for you to give up some of your time to talk to us about this topic. The first question I've got, it's a pretty basic one, but I just want to lay some foundations down for the viewers. Why do we get hotter when we exercise, and how important is cooling within that?
Yeah, really good and topical question. I guess the backdrop is there's exponential increases in land, sea and air temperatures at the moment. So probably irrelevant of how you engage in physical activity for more of the year, is going to be hotter and perhaps more humid. So it's a really topical question. So as humans, we're very inefficient at producing energy through metabolism. The big byproduct is heat. So because we're really inefficient and the inefficient byproduct is heat, that means we rapidly, if the environment around us is very warm, and particularly if it's very humid, our body temperatures and all the tissues within our body rapidly increase. So we produce energy via an oxygen-based process. There's a linear relationship between the amount of oxygen we consume and the amount of heat that we produce. So the longer and more intense your exercise is, the more O2 you consume, and thus, as an inefficient byproduct, we generate lots of excess heat that we really could do without, to be honest. Pretty much like a car engine as well. It's an inefficient byproduct of consuming oxygen to fuel physical activity, whether that's a Tour de France rider in the final stage or one of us plodding along for a 10K in 55 minutes or whatever it may be.
So how do we get rid of the heat that we produce?
Yeah, so as humans, so let's imagine we've got our person exercising, cycling or running, for example. We acquire heat from the environment around us, both directly and indirectly. So that adds, sorry, one of my cats is doing gymnastics. So we acquire heat from the environment, so directly to the body. So we're absorbing that heat directly from the sun or bouncing off the floor, whatever may be. The buildings around us, all these types of things. We also produce heat as an inefficient product as aerobic metabolism. We then lose heat in two predominant ways as humans. Firstly, and probably king of this process, is evaporative heat loss. So if the conditions around us are favourable, we sweat profusely, we evaporate that, the phase change of water to something else, the change in the molecules, that liberates heat. And that can account for the high 90% of our total heat loss during exercise. We also have radiative and convective heat loss of the skin, but that's generally low single figures percentages. The challenge really comes is when the environment around us is not compatible with evaporative heat loss. So if you imagine you're doing a watt bike session with no fan in front of you, or even with a fan, there's a pool of sweat on the floor next to you by the time you finish. Any sweat that pools on your skin and isn't evaporated, that's contributing nothing to losing body heat.
So if it's humid as well, I guess you're not getting that phase change.
Exactly. So if the environment around you is dense with water, so the water vapor pressure is high, hot, humid environment, think Singapore, the most humid environment you've ever been to. Essentially, evaporative heat loss, our key mechanism to lose heat, that's pretty much redundant. So that increase in body temperature occurs much more quickly, and things can go wrong a lot more quickly. But if it's 30 degrees, so if you're a cyclist, it's 30 degrees C, very dry environment around you, and obviously you're plodding along at 20, 30, 35 Ks an hour, you're getting additional evaporative heat loss and more favourable heat loss because you've got that increased velocity of air going over your body compared to a runner that's working at the same relative intensity, but they're probably only going along at, be generous, 15 Ks an hour or whatever it may be.
So this is why it can be a lot harder on a climb when you're going much slower, I guess.
Exactly, much slower, consuming more oxygen because you're working harder. You've got the residual fatigue of whatever's led to that climb, plus you've acquired body temperature during the preceding phase of the race or the stage until you hit the climb.
So in terms of like the thermoregulation of athletes, what is the kind of like tipping point? You have to regulate within a certain kind of range. Like what is that range, and what happens if you go over? And
yeah, so if we imagine we've got this person we've been chatting about quite a lot, cycling or running along. If we had lots of different people doing that task, they'd all reach a core temperature, a slightly different core temperature, where one, their performance would be compromised. So let's say, for example, anything above 39.5 degrees C, you're going to be hot and uncomfortable. Your performance might not necessarily be decremented. So half the people might be okay, half the people might be really suffering. And we'll loop back to how we prepare for the heat and all of those types of things. And it varies between intermittent-based activities, so rugby sevens, soccer, hockey, whatever it may be, and endurance-based exercise. And it really is individual dependent. So we have within and between participant variation. It just makes sense. We want to try and keep the body relatively cool during prolonged endurance-based exercise in the heat. It just makes sense. Lots of the biological processes are more efficient. We're sweating less, so we conserve our plasma volume. We have to take less fluid on board, less electrolytes, and it makes life much more simple. So we would typically say we want to maintain body temperature below 39.5. It depends on the athlete. And a bit like the energy systems, it's not a distinct cut-off. You get to 40.3 degrees C and you explode, or you get exertional heat illness or heat stress or anything like that. It really does vary. We know in some of the elite projects we've done, we've seen people tolerate remarkably high core body temperatures without getting exertional heat illness or heat stroke. So when we had the Tour of Qatar, for example, we had a cyclist with a 41.5 degrees C core temperature after the time trial. If you went into A&E or the emergency department, if you're in the States, with a body temperature over 40, the emergency physicians would be running around panicking. And if we look at the classic text of what are the criteria for exertional heat illness or heat stroke, one of those is a core body temperature above 40 degrees C. But if the athlete's prepared properly, so long-term heat acclimation or acclimatization, in-race cooling, these types of things, they're able to tolerate remarkably high core temperatures across a variety of sports, not just cycling, without having exertional heat illness or stroke. They'll obviously be pretty tired and uncomfortable by the time they finish. But if you think of just a normal person living in the desert, Qatar, the Middle East, for example, they'll be running of an evening in 40 degrees C for 10, 12 kilometers, coming back with very high core temperatures. But because they're seasonally acclimated, and they do smart things, they'll have frozen drinks when they're running, they might nip in the metro station where it's nicely AC to break up the run. We are able to tolerate that, and elite athletes really do tolerate the heat well, as long as they've engaged in long-term heat acclimation and other related preparation strategies.
So it sounds a bit like it's the thing, Kenyan runners and Ethiopian runners living at altitude and Rift Valley and all that, and then it sounds like there's another sort of group of athletes who live in very hot places who also have this kind of environmental advantage in terms of training and adaptation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space. The thing that's particularly challenging for elite athletes and athletes in general, recreational athletes, is unexpected heat. Right. So if you live in a country that has typical climatic variation, if you have a race towards the end of the summer where you've trained all summer in different variations of the heat, you're generally going to be okay. If it's an early race within the spring or the autumn, and you've had no heat, you've had a UK winter, you've been on the turbo inside, or you can't switch the heating on because it's too expensive, or all these types of things, you've suddenly got 27 degrees C for a 3-hour race or whatever it may be. And you've got your body's just completely unused to it. It's like going into the gym and going, do you know what? I'm going to start doing plyometrics. And you go crazy and do an hour of plyometrics. It's not going to end well, is it?
So the next day,
Exactly. Yeah. And it really is an interesting space because there's more unexpected heat now, and the hot season is longer and it starts earlier. So you could be doing them. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say, so you've got, people are familiar with the idea of like a lactate threshold. So is there a heat, like a thermoregulatory threshold? And so as well. And so what I'm sort of thinking is, while you're talking about super hot conditions, you're getting, if you go and run a marathon or ride up a climb or whatever, like if you're presumably better at, if you can raise that threshold, does that mean that you can raise your performance, even if it's not, say, an especially hot day?
Yeah, there's lots of chat in the scientific literature about whether being heat acclimated translates to improved performance within a temperate environment. The data is varied within that space. I would say, so whether I'm working with super elite athletes or weekend warriors who, classic people who've got a bit of cash and they want to do an extreme race at the weekend or in 6 months' time.
Me, to be honest.
Exactly. I see no negative effect of being robustly heat acclimated all year round. And it's relatively easy to achieve if you're a member of a gym, because you can do your endurance session, lock your bike up, put your trainers away, jump in the sauna or the steam room, and regularly expose the sauna ideally, or very hot water immersion. And you can get pretty much all of the adaptations from running in a chamber or doing a series of hot rides outside from those passive exposures after doing your endurance exercise. And they're really effective ways of maintaining your acclimation, because if we've got an elite group of athletes, we like to have some gas in the tank before they get to the hot place. It's like going to do an altitude camp as a cyclist. You probably want to spend some time, a few days, acclimatizing to the altitude before you kick on with the actual load. The biggest challenge comes where you're integrating those passive exposures or some heat exercise sessions with the prescribed training load. So if you're looking at someone like a triathlete or an ultra endurance athlete, they've got a busy day, or a team sport athlete, they've got a busy day already, 6-7 days a week. So you compromise the quality of the training if you do all of your training in the heat. So we prepare for the heat to reduce the decrement in performance. We're never going to do a PB in the heat, but we're trying to make that decrement compared to a temperate, cool environment as small as possible. And the solutions aren't super expensive or super sexy. There's really classic example. So a guy called Callum Hawkins, a Scottish marathon runner, he collapsed in Australia during the Commonwealth Games. He then he came fourth at the Doha 2019 World Athletics Championships in a world-class field in the most arduous environmental conditions we'd ever seen up until Tokyo. Even though it was at midnight, it was absolutely really hot, really humid. His preparation, and I paraphrase a little bit, was running in a shed in his garden in Glasgow or Edinburgh, I don't know where it is, with a load of heaters bought from Aldi. And he's come fourth in a world-class field with a load of athletes used to the heat.
Yeah.
So your recreational pro cyclists, they can easily jump in the hot tub after the race, after their training, or sauna, wear additional clothing when they're riding, doing their training.
Yeah.
And that will convey some protection.
Yeah. I mean, I've done some things in hot climates this year, and I've done pretty well for me in these events, and relatively speaking. And one of the things I did was just when I trained extensively on my indoor trainer in my spare room, I made sure it got very hot and humid in there, like deliberately, like not putting my fan on high power and stuff, and having the heating on and things like that. And I was recording the humidity and the temperature, and I was getting it up to 28 degrees and 95% humidity. And it was grim. It was so, but Well, I don't know. So you're saying that kind of thing can be beneficial, and that I was right in that it can help you adapt?
Yeah, 100%. We always say it's best to prepare for the worst. So we used to use the historical weather data as this is the worst it's going to be. But you've probably seen in the news every year, every month, records are being broken, southern and northern hemisphere. So an example, we were at the World Race Walk Championships in Oman in basically the end of winter for the Middle East. And the races were starting at 6 a.m. to miss the heat. It was still 31 WBGT, and this is winter. Nobody would have expected that from the athletes. And this unexpected heat is happening quite a lot. So for your race, these Blue Peter type approaches are perfect. Get the majority of your load outside, try and get sweaty, hot and uncomfortable without going crazy and doing some damage to yourself.
Yeah.
And just be prepared. It's definitely not rocket science, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah, that's a good takeaway for a lot of the viewers, I guess. The other thing I was keen to hear from you is just other strategies you can employ. So what about, we've seen in the Tour de France a lot of riders taking cooling, it appears, more seriously, but I don't really know much about it. But you see things like they were chucking bottles on themselves, loads more than they have done in previous years, ice vests, slushers, things like this. What are the other strategies and things like that, and how effective are they, and what are the best ones?
Yeah, so if we start we talk about long, short, medium to short, and race day preparation strategies, including within the race. So we'll talk from far out to the race and post-race, and we'll cover everything, hopefully. And anything I missed, just let me know, and I'll try my best to remember what I haven't said already. So the king among preparation strategies is long-term heat acclimatization and acclimation. You ideally want your athletes robustly acclimated all year round to the heat. If you're at altitude, you're going to need to do some passive exposures and be creative, because generally it's much cooler and it's an environment not conducive to being heat acclimated. In that scenario where you're concurrently exposing the riders to heat and altitude, the two main drivers of those adaptation is, one, at altitude, we increase red blood cell volume mass. So we're essentially trying to make the blood a little bit thicker. When we heat acclimate, we're looking to expand the plasma volume. So we're essentially making the blood more watery. So we've got two potentially conflicting mechanisms. Concurrently, we're trying to force adaptation, get the altitude adaptations as well as the heat. So when you co-prescribe them, you have got to be quite careful. But if I had to choose one strategy for my riders, I'd probably be more worried about the heat than the altitude, if I'm honest. But we know across the Tour de France, for example, we're going to get both. So we just have to be a bit careful. But long-term heat acclimation, whether that's riding in the heat, passive strategies, additional clothing, hot water exposures, sauna bathing, post-exercise, all those things are important to get your athlete to the race robustly heat acclimatized. Leading up to the race, we've obviously got a taper period where we look to consolidate those physiological adaptations we've derived from the prior training. Obviously, there's some residual fatigue. During those phases, we can carefully expose the athletes to passive exposures, hot water, etc., as I've already discussed, to retain that heat-related adaptation whilst we consolidate the physiological adaptations to give them the best capacities to perform in the race. So we get to race day, we've got a robustly acclimated athlete. So in the warm-up, we're going to look, you'll see them, they'll be under awnings, outside with fans on them, cooling vests, whatever may be. Try and keep their core body temperature as low as possible. So we get to pre-race, and you would have seen the riders outside. They'll be under the awning off the side of the bus, or whatever may be, big fans on them, ice vests. So we're looking to prepare them physiologically. So we've got a warm periphery, i.e. we're activated, ready to exercise, but we've got a cool core, because we want to be as cool as possible within our core to translate that into the race. So let's say you don't do any pre-cooling, you start the race at 38.5 degrees C core temperature, you're only 1.5 degrees from being close to a core temperature where we're going to have compromised exercise performance. But if we can keep the core temperature at 37 degrees C, we've got a heat sink, haven't we? We've got this extra core temperature range that we can explore during exercise. So we perform pre-cooling. That might be some aggressive cold water immersion, the re-warm up on the bikes with the ice vests on, the fans on them, all types of different things, ice collars, cold towels, everything like that. We get, and that's very much physically reducing body tissue temperatures, so core, skin, cerebral temperature, all of those types of things. The only thing we really need to worry about is delaying the sweat onset response. So if you do some super aggressive cooling, that can compromise how quickly we sweat, and we do want to sweat. That's our major mechanism for losing heat. So we don't want to compromise that, hence why an active warm-up is good. Other things to consider is if you've still got a very cold periphery, for example, if you're a race walker or a marathon runner or a cyclist, your ability to pace yourself is compromised. So you feel great, you go off like a rocket, and then everything catches up, so your cool periphery suddenly becomes very warm, you've got no heat sink left in the middle, and then so you've really got to run by your watch or your power meter or whatever you're using to make sure you don't go off too quickly. So we do basically aggressive cooling. We're aware that we don't want to delay the sweat onset. We want to make sure we don't compromise pacing because we disrupt that peripheral to central feedback. We don't want any GI distress for a long tour ride or stage ride or climb or whatever it may be. And then we're into the race proper. So we've got our long-term heat acclimated athlete. We've done our pre-cooling prior to the race, warm activated periphery, we're sweating, we've got a cool core, and we're into the race. Here, we're very unlikely, whatever we do, going to be able to reduce body tissue temperature because we simply can't dunk them and their bike in cold water to reduce body temperature. We're much more subtle exposures, and it's very much about checking that rise in core temperature.
Yep.
So we're pretty much interested in favourably altering the perceptions of their body temperature, i.e. feel a bit cooler than you actually are. And we're doing everything possible to reduce that rise in core temperature. So you'll see them wearing ice socks, so tights filled with water or various iterations of that. They'll have caps with ice and cold water in them. They'll be pouring water, ingesting ice slurries, rinsing their mouth with menthol maybe. That's some of the approaches they use. And we generally say it'll be, if you can get enough stuff, if you look at race walkers or marathon runners, they'll probably drink one and pour one. They'll literally go past the aid station, ice-filled cap or a frozen hat, ice cold water or slushy to drink, one or two to pour, ice towel around their neck, and they do that all on the fly. And that's pretty much what we're trying to do. If we're looking at more recreational riders, you can obviously wear an ice vest, but there comes a point where you're just carrying around essentially a little satchel of warm liquid that's giving you extra weight to go up a ride or whatever. So there are some that are basically vests which you can fill with what you're going to drink that's frozen, and then obviously you drink them, but because obviously you can't drink some phase change based chemicals, they don't last particularly long. We produce heat very quickly. So during the race, we're looking to check that rise in core temperature. We're looking to favourably alter the perceptions of being hot and uncomfortable. And then post-race, we generally want very aggressive cold water immersion to drive down body tissue temperature, aid with recovery, encourage the athletes to sleep, and to engage in eating and drinking. Because if you're very hot, well, we probably want to go even more than that. We want 10 to 15 degree water for 10 to 15 minutes. So that's probably the cheapest thing, wheelie bin filled with ice water, make sure it's been stirred around. But some of the buses on the tour, for example, they'll have bespoke, externally powered ice water immersion devices of some description.
Wow. I wasn't aware of that. That's I've seen like the cryo chamber things and stuff at a few events that you can jump in. Look pretty crazy, but yeah, I guess that's what that's for in that instance. So something that we get criticised for is our kit, is our sort of current GCN kit is predominantly black, right? So in your experience, how bad is that? Is it bad?
It's pretty bad. It's not the smartest decision you can make. If you go to a slightly different sport, if you look at Lucy Charles, who's just won Kona after coming second 3 or 4 times. If you look at some of her earlier races, she had jet black garments. And obviously, some of it's branding, you've got to get the logos on there, that type of stuff. But wearing black is probably the worst thing you can do. And you probably saw Froome, he had basically like a vest with little holes in it, and he ended up with the worst sunburn you've ever seen, like all different pictures of it. So there's 2 things. Ideally, you want it to reflect some of the heat rather than absorb it. So there's different textiles you can use. Ideally, you probably want to be as naked as possible because you want to have as much skin available for evaporative heat loss. So a white suit is ideal. Obviously, with the girls, we have some privacy issues as well. With the guys, it's not...
white bib shorts. No one wants to see that.
Exactly. So, yeah, black is not a great idea. And there was a time ago that I think it was Team Sky. Can't remember who it was. They developed something called ice black, which is basically a black that was meant to keep you cooler compared to the normal black. And the data wasn't fantastic in that space. And if you look around at the teams, there's very few people riding in black these days. So, yeah, as light as possible, as naked as possible. And in terms of sunscreen, you probably want to use an alcohol-based one rather than oil. If you use an oil-based sunscreen, it stops you sweating, whereas the alcohol-based ones allow you to sweat.
So that's a really interesting thing. So what's in them? Is it like isopropyl alcohol? Is it?
Yeah, different iterations of it. Some alcohol-based ones obviously do sting you, especially if you're sunburned or you've got sensitive skin. But there's some really good brands of sun cream out there. So obviously you can take this out or not. But HelioCare is a really good one. HelioCare Sport is fantastic. Do quite a lot of work in cricket as well as being a former cricketer. So you couldn't really try and spend more time in the sun than playing those sports, and so that's really good cream to wear. HelioCare Sport's a really good one. And
does sun cream? I've seen like the adverts in the past, the viral videos of where they film people under UV cameras, and it looks like you're blacking up when you've got sun cream on. You know, with it. So does sun cream actually help cool you down, keep you cooler by blocking UV, or is there?
So I'm not super familiar with the data specifically to that. If you wear oil-based sun cream, you're going to end up a lot hotter and uncomfortable compared to wearing no sun cream or a good alcohol-based one, for sure. And if you wear oil-based one and you're sweating profusely, it often blocks the pores and gives you like prickly heat type symptoms as well. So if you've got sensitive skin, it's not a good idea. If you've got a good sun cream, if you're getting up early for a ride, it's probably best to put your sun cream on first whilst you're basically in the buff, have your breakfast, activation, all that type of stuff. And then if it's a good one, you'll be protected for most of the day.
Wow. No, that's some really good tips. And it's been fascinating talking to you, Lee. Thanks so much for your time. And I can't wait to see what people think. They can post their comments and questions down below in the comments section. But thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thanks very much for having me. I hope everyone enjoys it.
Thanks so much to Lee for giving up his time to have that discussion with us. I found it super interesting, and it's left me with loads more questions about the topic. Also think we need to rethink the colour of our GCN kit. But if you found it interesting and have your own questions on it and would like to see them answered in a subsequent video, then fire them down in the comments section below and make sure you subscribe, as it's something that I would love to look into in the future. I'm going to go now and buy some alcohol-based sunscreen. Love you. Bye.